I plan to break down a discussion of the Napoleonic historiography into a couple of videos because it'll take too long for one. So in the first video, I want to engage with a couple of questions. One is, what is a historical debate? And the second question I'd like to focus on is just thinking about the question of the debate around Napoleon's influence in France and Europe. So the debate that we've selected as the kind of flagship of our discussion of Napoleonic historiography. So firstly, what is a historical debate? I think it's got a few elements to it. It might sound like a simple, theme that we can, obviously it's a disagreement over something, but what does that actually mean in practice? I think if we break it down, what a historical debate really is a formal or informal discussion, debate, discussion, disagreement over a particular historical issue, period, person, event. In a sense, what that means is that I think this is a contest over the way we represent the meaning of a person or event, and over how we think it should be remembered. So, for example, if we concentrate on Napoleon here, now, are we suggesting some historians would, that Napoleon actually should be remembered in a kind of positive way, that he should be remembered as a peacemaker? Or should Napoleon be remembered as a kind of, in a sense, a dictator who brought conquest to Europe rather than peace? So I think this idea of it being a contest, the debate being a contest over the meaning and memory of a historical issue, is probably a good way to think of that. The third element that I think is really important about it, though, is actually how a historical debate takes shape. And I think any historical debate these days is generally played out through all aspects of a society's cultural endeavours. So, for example, we get academic historians publishing books about it. We get the media often weighing into historical debates. If you think about the Anzac Legend debate in Australia, the media is all over that. We have films contributing to it, so film directors making films that give us some sense of the meaning and memory of a particular event, perhaps. We also have many websites now, almost too many you might say. But certainly the internet can be both a great source of information and a very, very misleading source of information, and one in which many historians would be very critical. But it's still an important reflection. This is, in a sense, your bloggers and so on, your history enthusiasts, they might be developing this debate through their own research and insights. And although we may not necessarily agree with some of their conclusions, they're still a legitimate part of the debate, and they're still an important part of the debate that we need to understand. And finally, in a much more simple manner, social media also plays a role in this. Your memes and caricatures of certain things, they help contribute to people's impressions of something. So they are involved in this battle for the meaning and memory of a particular issue. So don't overlook certain things like internet sources and social media, even though they're obviously very different to, say, a few hundred-page published academic work. If we concentrate then on this idea of Napoleon's influence on France and Europe, what we're really discussing is the battle over, the historical battle over whether Napoleon was primarily for the good, or he was primarily, in a sense, a regressive force for both France and Europe. So let's unpack this a little bit more specifically. We might be asking questions like, do the historians represent Napoleon as someone who restored the glory of France, say, in a new republican form? Or was he more someone we should remember as someone who basically restored a version of the ancient regime? So he wasn't actually progressive, but regressive. We need to ask our historians, or ask of our historians, whether they're suggesting that he was someone who generated peace and stability, or whether he was someone who essentially brought war and conquest to Europe. So Napoleon himself claimed that he was actually operating in an attempt to bring about peace in Europe, okay, especially for France, but also in Europe as well. He argued that it was England basically organizing these coalitions against him, and that his resistance to that in the end brought peace through the Grand Empire. Now, there are obviously many people who argue that that's a nice excuse for warmongering and conquering large territories. So there are many different versions or interpretations of that. Thirdly, as we've begun to see, This debate really also, people are weighing into it by looking at his reforms. Some are arguing that his reforms really brought forward the ideals of the revolution, whereas others, such as Bonnie Smith, American feminist historian, saying that his reforms really left out large tracts of the population and therefore actually didn't do anything to improve their lives, and in the long run perhaps even worsened them. So there is a debate about this as well. His influence in in bringing about certain reforms, is certainly a contest. And finally, there's this one other element that we might concentrate on here, is whether Napoleon laid the foundations for the peaceful integration of Europe. Now, obviously, no one, I think, really argues that we need to grab the exact Napoleonic system and bring it back into the 21st century. That doesn't mean, however, that some people don't see his system as largely good and stable and cooperative, and therefore suggest that in the long run it's people who are looking back to groups like, say, ancient Rome or Napoleon, and we need to actually draw on that legacy as a way of thinking about current integration issues in Europe. So there's a long-term view to the debate about Napoleon's influence on France and Europe as well. The important point with this is that as you discuss your historians in question 2 essays, you need to be showing what they actually think about specific issues. It's not just looking at their social context and that context influence on their general thinking about Napoleon, but what evidence they drag up to actually suggest, say, he was a great reformer or that his reforms were damaging. To what evidence do they drag up to suggest that he was taking France in a kind of progressive republican direction, or regressing back towards something like the rule of the Bourbon monarchs. So your discussion needs to focus not just on general impressions of Napoleon, but on their specific claims about his influence on France and Europe.